Hello everyone. So I'd like to go over some traditional two-dimensional design concepts for the upcoming projects that we're going to be doing. So this class is Introduction to Digital Art, but of course we can't discuss digital art without discussing traditional art. It all stems from the same place, and a lot of the terminology that we use to talk about two-dimensional or three-dimensional images or objects is the same thing. So to begin, I'd like to talk about some compositional elements, and here we're going to talk about balance. I want you to think about how this concept can apply to the images that you see in your everyday life in photographs and paintings and pictures, but balance, right? So I'm sure some of you have some idea of what I'm referring to here, but when we look at a two-dimensional image, you'll hear me say the word composition quite a bit, right? What is the composition? How is this image composed, right? And if we think about that word composition, we can think about it from the sciences, right? I mean, what is the composition of this mineral? Basically, what I'm asking is what is this mineral made of? And when I ask, discuss the composition of a picture plane, I'm asking, well, how is this picture plane organized? What is this picture plane made up of? And one of the ways that a composition can be discussed is in terms of balance. Now, here we have a pretty mundane image of a sky and a building. And if I were to ask you, well, is this image balanced? Then you could make the argument that formally it's balanced. We have the structure in the bottom right-hand corner of the building, and then in the upper left-hand corner, we could say those clouds somewhat give a balance to the image. So we have this diagonal that splits through. This is kind of a stretch, but we can see where I'm getting at here. It's probably more noticeable in images like this, right? If you know what this building is, this is the Taj Mahal. And if I were to ask you, is this image balanced? My hope is that you would say yes, right? I mean, we just look at the image and it's a quite clear symmetrical balance of the sides, right? The left side mirrors the right side almost identically, right? So this image is balanced, we would say. Here's another example. Right? We can see there's symmetrical balance, right? The composition is balanced, is what we would say. And again, if we think about the sciences right here, we don't call this bilateral symmetry in the arts, but the concept comes from nature, right? If we look at, this turtle and beetle, I mean, these insects and animals are bilaterally symmetrical, right? As if you cut them in half, the one side mirrors the other side exactly. So here are some more examples of balance, right? And one way that you can think about this balance, I mean, obviously it's clear when there's an image that's a mirror image of itself on the left and the right, but think about a visual plane like this, right? If you look at a visual image, imagine a seesaw, right? Or a fulcrum at the bottom of the image. And if the image would basically sit more or less on that plane without leaning too far to the left or too far to the right, then we'd say that's balance, right? And we can see in the top image, you have the two human figures at equal distances from the fulcrum, and the visual weight there is the same. We can see, okay, this image is balanced. If we look at that image in the middle, we have the one larger circle balancing out the two smaller circles. So in this case, we would say it's balanced as well. It may not be symmetrically balanced because it's not identical, but the visual weight is the same. We can see that the weight of the larger circle in our minds would match the weight of the two smaller circles. So that's another instance of balance. And then if we look at the very bottom, we can see that, that image makes sense to us as far as being balanced. We have the smaller square further out to the left, and then we have the larger square closer to the fulcrum. So according to physics, that might be an equal distribution of weight, so that image could in of itself be considered to be balanced as well. So I'll show you a few more images here of balance, right? And we can think about, is the image symmetrically balanced or is it asymmetrically balanced, right? So symmetrically balanced would be this image here, right? Symmetrically balanced. This image here, symmetrically balanced. But when we go back to an image that is like this, is this image balanced? Well, it's quite clearly not symmetrically balanced, but if we think about those three prior seesaw images with the fulcrums, if you were to put a fulcrum at the bottom middle of this painting, would it be balanced? So here, let's split it down the middle. And then if we put a fulcrum there, we can try to make sense of the visual weight of the image. Seems to me that it might be heavier on the right, but that's okay. And again, a lot of these concepts that we'll go over, a lot of these ideas behind composition, there's not necessarily right or wrong ways. I'm just trying to get us to think about these concepts and think about the proper terminology, right? A symmetrically balanced image doesn't necessarily mean it's all that interesting or engaging. In fact, many times, symmetrically balanced images can be quite boring, right? I mean, if you think about those examples I showed earlier, yeah, I mean, they're interesting images, they're nice images, but they may not be the most engaging. So here's another painting here. If we think about balance again, now it's clear it's not symmetrically balanced, right? That line to make this image symmetric, or at least to give it the same visual weight, it's off-centered to the left a little bit, right? If we think about that big square versus that little square, the big square being closer to the fulcrum, the equivalent here would be the figures, right? The mother and the children and the massive figures behind being closer to that fulcrum, and then the right side of the image opens up quite a bit, and the spacing of those trees could be considered to balance out the density of the figures on the left. Here's another example of balance here. Now it's not symmetrically balanced identically, right? There are some small variances on the left and the right, but we could say that this is pretty symmetrically balanced, even though it's not identical. And then the last type of balance here I wanted to discuss is radial balance. So we see this in nature as well too. So we have bilateral symmetry of the lobster, and we have an organic object like the shovel. And then we have radial symmetry here, and we see this in nature quite often, right? Here's an example of fruit and a flower. But as far as two-dimensional images go, in image making, right, there's radial balance here. We see stained glass windows, right? We can see examples of this in baskets. So think about balance, right? And think about these three terms of balance: symmetrical balance, asymmetrical balance, and radial balance. And I want you to try to get into the habit of, when you're looking at images now, whether online or in person, imagine that fulcrum again. Think about, okay, are these images balanced? And you'll see that most often the more engaging and interesting images are not necessarily the most balanced, right? Sometimes you have really wide swings of weight distribution, right, to make an image more interesting. Okay,